Another Crab's Treasure is one of the best video games ever made. It's so good that it took my Game of the Year spot in 2024 over what I consider as the best Sonic game to ever come out, being Sonic X Shadow Generations. And I love Sonic, if you couldn't tell. I know Another Crab's Treasure has gotten acknowledgement online during its launch for being a cool, alternative, quirky little different Souls-like that ended up being pretty good, but I think a lot of people took for granted how good it is for someone who hasn't really clicked with Souls-likes before. I think because the game has established itself as a Souls-like, a genre in which its founding and most popular entries are intentionally difficult in ways that not everybody jives with, I think a game that polarizing puts a mental note in anyone's head who's tried it, to where if they hear a new game as a Souls-like, they'll immediately get interested or immediately get disinterested. So the people who saw that Another Crab's Treasure was a Souls-like and ended up playing and enjoying it were players who were already familiar with the Souls-like genre and had been a fan of those games prior to the game's release. And from that point of view, yes, the game did get good reviews and it was very well received, but no one really said it was like the best game ever, which to me it is, as someone who actively dislikes Souls-like games, but was able to find the enjoyment that everybody else finds in other Souls-like games in Another Crab's Treasure due to how much more user-friendly the experience is, with the game being designed to have the player be directly taught and properly introduced to all the things they can do. This idea around the game being a more easy to digest, less cryptic and less convoluted version of Dark Souls is what really sold me on trying this game, because the only reason I hadn't been able to get into Dark Souls wasn't because of the boss difficulty or having to more deliberately time your attacks and pay attention to a stamina meter and stuff like that. That stuff I liked. What I didn't like was all the systems around it being intentionally cryptic for the sake of discovery, which I do think has value, but it's just something I personally don't like. So to see this game forego that, as well as add some assist mode options of being able to alter damage and HP or prevent you from losing your loot on death, were enough of a comfort to make me actually want to try this game. That, and when I first saw the game in a Nintendo Direct, what they were going for artistically, visually, and narratively, with this whole beautiful ocean, cutesy, cartoon crabs, juxtaposed to these devastating, polluted, trash-ridden monsters, harming the ecosystem of their world, with a vibe that to them would mirror what Dark Souls looks to us, with all these creepy, grotesque human monsters. But for them it's a crab version and it's real because of pollution. I just thought that whole idea was so great, not only for a game but especially a Souls-like, and a very unique way to get away from the Souls-like aesthetic while still paying tribute to the core idea of what that aesthetic can bring to a typical FromSoft Souls-like game, or at least an aspect of it, right? So the game already intrigued me on that level, but then there's the gameplay that keeps a lot of the core Souls-like elements intact, like hard bosses, it being third person where you lock on and dodge roll and time your attacks with the boss's attacks for melee, and being able to use spells, and the exploration. It's all the same core gameplay elements that makes combat in the Soulsborne games so great, but without all those medieval RPG elements where you have a bunch of stats that isn't very clear what they're used for, and other elements that make the game less beginner friendly besides the actual difficulty of the game. And that really intrigued me because Elden Ring is a game that I got around its launch because of how well received it was, and I just couldn't figure it out. It just didn't click with me, and I put the game down. But ever since then, I kept hearing online that the Dark Souls games have the hardest learning curve, but once you understand the flow of the game and how every attack is a deliberate action that you have to think about and how satisfying that can be, it really made me interested in that gameplay experience. And once I saw the trailer for Another Crab's Treasure, I knew that this was the game that would help me understand this genre. And not only did it help me understand it, but Another Crab's Treasure is one of my favorite games of all time. And I still don't like Souls games such as Elden Ring. I've tried to go back and play it, but Another Crab's Treasure just hooks me in a way that other Souls-likes don't, due to the simplification of Dark Souls mechanics in like the most brilliant ways possible, mainly with the mechanic of the shell. So normally in Souls-like games, at the beginning of the game you'll have a choice between multiple classes for your character, and then you're locked into that class for the rest of the game, meaning that if you get up to a particular boss that is super difficult and feel as though swapping your class would maybe help you defeat that boss or play the game in a way that's more fun for you, you'll just never know, and you always have that nagging feeling of like, what if I was this different class? And what gameplay possibilities am I missing out on to approach this fight just because I chose this class over another? Another Crab's Treasure fixes that issue by having no classes at all. You're just the crab. But the benefits you would get from such a system, like being able to play around with different abilities and get different equipment and all of that stuff, has been incorporated instead into the ingenious shell system. The story of Another Crab's Treasure is that your shell has been taken away and you need to go get it back. You're a hermit crab, you need your shell. It's your home. So the main character Krill sets off on an adventure to get that shell back. But along the way, there are other types of shells called garbage, where whatever you put on not only gives you a temporary shield to defend yourself with that shield having its own life bar, but after the first boss fight of the game, each type of garbage shell ends up giving you a special magic ability you can use, meaning that strewn about throughout the entire game world, you will have pieces of garbage lying around that you can literally just use at a moment's notice to essentially change your class and gain a new ability, whether that be shooting out magic, rolling into someone, making a smoke screen so you can't get detected, buffing you so your melee attacks do more damage. All of the variety is packed into the shells. But then it goes even deeper, because the shells are not only your defense and your way to access unique abilities, but it can also be the sword you use itself. So for a decent portion of the beginning of the game, the only way you'll be able to attack outside of your shells is with the little fork that you're given near the beginning of the game. And that is the case until you get a skill called Scrap Hammer that allows you to take the shell on your back and stick your fork into it, making it into a makeshift weapon, as well as storing the shell for later so you can use a different shell with a different ability in the meantime. And it creates this whole gameplay loop of cycling through shells, deciding which ones to use for your sword and have backup for later, which ones will be your main one, how will you approach the fight because of all of that, and adds a lot of the complexity that you might get in a traditional Dark Souls game, but all wrapped cleanly in this shell mechanic surrounding a melee weapon that stays the same throughout the entire game outside of being able to upgrade its attack power. And then what ties this shell mechanic all together is just the fact that they're pieces of trash that are littered throughout the world and can break once you use them a certain amount. It makes it so you have less choosing and more just doing. Because while the exploratory aspect of figuring out game's mechanics through digging into its systems, testing out different things, looking into different menus and text boxes to figure out what exactly is the most optimal, can be enjoyable in its own way. I like doing it in League of Legends, but when it comes to a single player game like Dark Souls, I personally don't click with it. It just creates choice paralysis, and I just spend more time trying to figure out how to play the game than enjoying playing the game. So to just have abilities and everything kind of chosen for me based on just the environment around me ends up working out really well, but not in a way that takes playstyle customization completely away from the player's control, as you can prioritize hanging on to the shells you like, and even choose to buy shell insurance later in the game that gives you a fresh shell of whatever insurance you bought every time you recover at a respawn point. But to buy insurance, you have to first pick up and use the shell in the overworld, meaning that at some level there is forced variety, which is part of what makes this game so fun, because you get to discover what works best for you in fighting some of the toughest challenges in gaming relative to other genres, with abilities and playstyles that you were forced to use through this shell durability system. Meaning that when you find something you like, you know you like it, and you don't have to play through the game 5 different times with 5 different classes to determine your preferred playstyle. It's very simple and intuitive, but it allows you to get so much done just all through the concept of a shell, to the point where even your weight class is determined by the shell you're using. And it's pretty intuitive, because if you're using a bottle cap, obviously that'll be lightweight, but something like a coconut would be heavier, which just makes sense. It's so intuitive that I didn't even consciously think about the fact that there is different weight classes with the shell until recording gameplay footage for this video, where I remembered that's another attribute from the Dark Souls series that got recontextualized into the shell system. Not that the differences in weight aren't noticeable and aren't something I factored into playing the game, but it's just not something that you directly think about because you just naturally expect a bottle cap to be more lightweight than a coconut shell. And then with that shell being trash that's littered all throughout the world, and you can just swap and experiment, and sometimes it breaks and you need to get a new shell. So you have that kind of durability, let's just try whatever's on hand kind of system that is present in Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom there too. It works so well together, so perfectly. It allows for so much more experimentation rather than just choosing between, oh, is this a sword that boosts my attack at the risk of losing some defense or boosting my defense and attack speed. It's more of a natural flowing cycle of swapping and discarding and breaking most of the time different shells and just having to figure out what will work in what moment. But it's not so random that you can't hone in on a particular strategy that you want to do. So you can choose between a bunch of different options and pick your favorite one, but now you actually know it's your favorite one because you were forced to try everything through picking up shells. And it's just such a simple yet intuitive system that can help you experiment and find out what's interesting about the genre of Soulslikes, letting people play with that variety that people who spend thousands and thousands of hours in Soulslikes have been able to experience, but in a package that's just immediately understandable and playable. You just pick it up, and all these mechanics flow in a way that is so intuitive that you don't even think about it. It's just such an intuitive system that it makes you wonder why it had to be so complicated in those other games in the first place. And speaking of overcomplicated systems in Dark Souls games, there's of course the leveling up system. And there's a bunch of different things to level up, like mind, intelligence, dexterity, but what they do depends on a bunch of other factors, and it just gets kind of complicated. But I like Another Crab's Treasure because it streamlines it into just 4 things that are very simple. They are health, shell defense, attack damage, and magic damage. But the conveniences of understanding what you're leveling up doesn't mean you're just gonna have everything handed to you. You still have to commit to what you're leveling up, so there's still a bit of uncertainty there. But now figuring out what I want to specialize in is a much more natural and easy task to do, with the shell durability system getting me to try out all these different things to figure out what I like, instead of just putting stats into attack and maybe a bit of defense and hoping for the best. I feel like every change they made to the core Souls-like formula that was established from FromSoft in Another Crab's Treasure, it's not stuff that makes the game easier in a way where the game and its challenges are actually more difficult, but just easier in the sense that you don't have to worry about not knowing something in order to play the game better. There's no super hidden secret other than maybe finding a rare piece of trash in an area that is off the beaten path. All of the challenge are just in the enemies and the way they're programmed themselves. Although not having stamina of any kind and being able to just sprint and dodge whenever you want does give you a lot of leeway, but the game is designed around that. In fact, running around, jumping, and even dodging sometimes is essential in what is essentially this game's not so secret half once you start playing through it and realizing that this game is not only a Souls-like, but also a 3D platformer, with our crab friend being able to do a little hover and the ability to dodge once, sometimes twice depending on the height, for some extra horizontal distance. You also get this grapple ability where you can hold down the left trigger to grapple to certain points in the level, and this ties into combat in a fun way by being able to be used on enemies to pull them in, with a little fishing tug-of-war minigame having to be played if used on bosses, which was a really fun and sometimes useful thing to do, but it's not really core to the combat. You don't really need to use it, but you can if you want. There's a lot of variety in the way you can approach combat in this game that is all multi-purpose and fits together so well. That's what I like about all this, is that everything in this game is just very multi-purpose. But this multi-purpose design isn't just limited to the combat, but in all aspects of the game, with one of my favorite examples of this being this big shopping cart that fell at the bottom of the ocean, being used to obviously visually indicate the theming of this game, which is trekking across a trash-polluted world, but also, platforming wise, there's these milk cartons that are stuck to the handle of this upside-down shopping cart, giving you a platforming section to explore above, but also below in this little caged area that is created with the same shopping cart. This type of cleverness in the level design reminds me a lot of Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, Soulslikes, which is a 2D platformer from Nintendo. And in fact, a lot of this game kind of reminds me of what a Nintendo version of a Souls-like game would be like, as Nintendo is known to take genres they haven't tackled and put their own kind of cool twist on them that makes a lot of sense in hindsight, like with Splatoon for shooters, ARMS, and Super Smash Bros. For fighting games, as well as the bunch of other genres that they have defined and redefined over the years. And I think Another Crab's Treasure falls into the category of those great games. And I think if the game was the exact same but developed by Nintendo instead of an indie studio, that it would be a wildly more popular game. Having a gameplay loop as fun as the Dark Souls gameplay loop, but molded into a Nintendo-esque 3D platformer is literally a dream come true for me, because this gameplay is just so fun and addicting. For all the reasons I said earlier, but also mixed with the fact that the only way you can regenerate your magic is by using your normal fork attacks. So if you want to play the game most efficiently, you gotta decide when to go in, get a couple hits, when to go back, and maybe utilize your spells from a range distance, or when you'll have the time to trigger it if it's more of a melee ability, as some of them, like the buff-based abilities, have a wind-up timer similar to healing or attacking. This combat, mixed with the exploration and just general 3D platforming that is in this game, is what makes it so fun, as each checkpoint in this game where you can teleport and heal and level up acts kind of as a beginning and starting point for any particular like platforming challenge. Is kind of what I consider the levels in this game to be, other than the big broader named areas you can explore. And every segment between these checkpoints is just so well designed from a 3D platforming perspective that even without the combat, I still think I would have enjoyed my time with this game. But because of that hard combat system in there, the challenge doesn't just come from being able to platform through the level, but also deciding what weapons are best to approach the situation, what abilities are best to approach the enemies, what's worth skipping over, and all of this moment-to-moment decision making, even outside of the boss fights, which are usually the highlights of Souls games, creates a game that is constantly fun, constantly engaging, in a way that just wasn't present for me in other Souls-like games. Maybe it's because I mainly played Elden Ring, where you kind of run around and find something that's too difficult, and then run around and find something that's too difficult again, and it just kind of feels like a big empty world where you're not doing very much, at least at the beginning. Whereas Another Crab's Treasure is always giving you something to think about due to showing you what you can do, and then letting you apply it immediately in a world that is a lot more condensed due to being designed more as a 3D platformer instead of a world that is not made for platforming. A perfect example of this difference would be Sonic Frontiers, where that game is a platformer, but all of the terrain isn't really made for platforming, and it's only in that game due to slapped on platforming elements that aren't naturally incorporated into the world at all. Everyone agrees that that game would be better if those level design elements were actually part of the world instead of pasted on top, and that's what Another Crab's Treasure does, which is obviously not the case in other Souls-likes due to them not really being platformers. And as a result, it creates this awesome moment-to-moment gameplay where you're always either platforming or fighting or exploring a little bit for shells and other upgrades that you can find through challenging platforming segments or just littered across the world. All of these three elements of platforming, exploring, and combat not only fit so well together in the way this game was made, but also ensures that you will always have something to be able to do and work toward. And dude, some of those stretches are just so fun and tense, trying to get to the next area without losing health because there's a lot of enemies. Like once you get later into the game, and even earlier in the game, like trying to survive from moon snail location to moon snail location is just very well done and is by far the best part of this game, as it also includes platforming challenges just naturally baked into this whole adventure. So sometimes you're doing this platforming challenge, but then on one of the platforms there's a monster, so you have to literally go into like Dark Souls style combat with the slow wind-ups for attacks and everything. And by the way, they absolutely nailed the feel of this game. It feels the exact same as a Dark Souls game, but you have all that and then you're platforming again, or maybe the enemy is too dangerous and you just want to platform over them. Like that's an option too. You can literally like platform over things and find ways to get around stuff. I feel like this genre and 3D platforming just makes sense together, honestly. It is kind of a hybrid concept to have a 3D platformer Souls-like, but it's done so well here that it honestly doesn't even feel like a hybrid. It feels like this is how it was always meant to be, right? Obviously, it's inspired off Dark Souls and has a lot of the same combat elements, but the way they were able to weave it all together into this masterpiece of a game is awesome. And I want to see more game developers take a crack at making more user-accessible Souls-like games after this, because I think Another Crab's Treasure proved without a shadow of a doubt that the difficulty and unique combat of Dark Souls with all of its boss fights are not mutually exclusive to a lot of these cryptic design decisions that make the game difficult in ways that aren't palatable to some gamers like me. And underneath all of it, you know, Dark Souls, it's a hell of a fucking combat system. I love it. I absolutely love it. It would be easier if I could give all the credit to Another Crab's Treasure's devs, but hey, the combat system, even though it's not original, it's so much fun. And the fact that they've been able to take that and mold it into this masterpiece of a game that isn't just good for the gameplay, but the soundtrack too. Listen to the music. It's been playing in the background. Listen. It's fire as hell. So yeah, the soundtrack is fire, the game is fire. You should play it if you haven't already. It's on Switch, PlayStation, Xbox, PC. It's also a budget title, so it's about half the price of typical big video games out there, so that's a plus too. If you do end up playing it, I hope you enjoy it as much as I do, because I think it's literally one of the best games ever made. It's definitely in my top 5. But I'd love to hear what you guys think about the game in the comment section below as well, so don't forget to share your thoughts and subscribe to see more content like this in the future.